Mija, come stir this. If you ever heard those words standing on a step stool in a kitchen thick with the smell of roasted chiles and warm lard, you already know what this video is about. A Mexican housewife in the 1960s did not need a cookbook or a kitchen timer. She could stretch a single pound of meat across 3 meals, turn yesterday's stale tortillas into something her kids fought over, and coax deep flavor out of scraps most cooks today would toss in the trash. One trick on this list turns a handful of dried peppers into a sauce that tastes like it simmered all day. Another kept a pot of beans alive on the stove for a whole week without a single batch going bad. These were kitchen secrets passed from abuela to mother to daughter, and most of them have quietly disappeared from everyday cooking. Here are 25 clever cooking tricks only 1960s Mexican housewives knew, and we forgot. So hit subscribe, because a few of these might just change the way you cook tonight. Number 25. Stretching masa with boiled potato. When corn masa ran low before payday, a 1960s housewife did not panic. She boiled a potato, mashed it smooth, and folded it straight into the masa. The dough stayed soft. The tortillas still puffed on the comal. And nobody at the table could tell the difference. It was not a shortcut. It was arithmetic. 1 potato could stretch a batch of masa meant for 8 tortillas into 12 or 14. The starch in the potato helped the dough hold moisture, so the tortillas came out tender instead of cracking apart. Families in South Texas and along the border used this trick for generations. Some added a pinch of salt and a small spoonful of lard to keep the texture right. By the time pre-made masa flour became cheap and easy to find, the potato trick faded. But for decades, it was the reason a family of 7 could eat tortillas every single day on almost nothing. Number 24. Charring tomatoes directly on the comal for salsa. Before blenders took over, a housewife made salsa by laying whole tomatoes, a couple of serrano peppers, and half an onion straight onto a dry, screaming hot comal. She let them blister and blacken on every side, turning them with her fingers. That char gave the salsa a smoky sweetness that no amount of boiling or roasting in an oven could replicate. Once everything was soft and spotted black, she ground it all together in a molcajete with a clove of garlic and a fistful of salt. The result was a salsa that tasted alive. Comal charred salsa was not a recipe. It was instinct, and the technique made even winter tomatoes with no flavor taste rich and deep. Today, most people dice raw tomatoes or dump a can into a blender, and they wonder why it never tastes like abuela's. Number 23. Saving every drop of rendered fat in a coffee can by the stove. Every 1960s Mexican kitchen had one. A metal coffee can sitting next to the burner, half full of pale yellow lard or bacon drippings. Nothing got poured down the drain. Whenever pork was fried or chorizo was cooked, the leftover fat went straight into that can. It was the all-purpose cooking fat for everything. Beans, rice, tortillas, eggs at dawn. The fat carried flavor from every meal before it, building a depth that clean oil from a bottle could never match. Some families kept 2 cans, one for pork fat and one for beef tallow. The practice was so common that Abuela could tell you how old the grease was by its color. When doctors and food companies started pushing vegetable oils in the 1970s, the coffee can slowly disappeared from the stovetop, and a generation of flavor went with it. Number 22. Soaking dried chiles in hot water to bring them back to life. A bag of dried guajillo, ancho, or pasilla chiles could sit in the pantry for months. When a housewife needed a mole or an enchilada sauce, she tore the stems off, shook out the seeds, and dropped them into a bowl of near-boiling water. In 20 minutes, those brittle peppers turned soft, plump, and deeply fragrant. She blended them into a smooth paste with garlic, a little cumin, and sometimes a piece of toasted bread to thicken it. That paste became the backbone of dozens of sauces that tasted like they took all day, but actually started from a handful of peppers and a bowl of hot water. The trick was never letting the chiles boil. Boiling made them bitter. A patient soak in still hot water drew out the sweetness and kept the skin silky. Number 21. Refrying yesterday's rice with an egg folded in. Leftover rice never went to waste. The next morning, a housewife heated a spoonful of lard in a skillet, dumped in the cold rice from the night before, and let it crackle and crisp on the bottom without stirring. Then she cracked an egg right on top, broke the yolk, and folded the whole thing together until the egg coated every grain. A sprinkle of salt, maybe a few drops of salsa, and breakfast was done in 5 minutes. The cold rice fried better than fresh because the grains had dried out overnight, giving them a chew and a crunch that soft, just-cooked rice could never achieve. Families along the border called it simply arroz con huevo, and children who grew up eating it still crave it decades later. Number 20. Adding a sprig of epazote to the bean pot. Epazote is a pungent, jagged-leafed herb that grows wild across Mexico and the American Southwest. In the 1960s, nearly every housewife who cooked pinto or black beans from scratch dropped a sprig of it into the pot, along with an onion and a clove of garlic. The herb did two things. It gave the beans an earthy, slightly medicinal flavor that balanced the richness of the lard, stirred in at the end. And it helped with digestion. Families swore that a pot of beans cooked with epazote caused far less trouble at the table than one cooked without it. Epazote was never sold in grocery stores back then. Women picked it from a patch in the yard or along the fence line. It grew like a weed because it was one. Today, it is harder to find in some parts of the United States, and most people under 50 have never heard of it. Number 19. Soaking rice in hot water before frying it to get every grain separate. In most American kitchens today, rice goes straight from the bag into the pot. But a 1960s Mexican housewife knew that was a fast way to end up with a sticky clump. Before she made arroz rojo or arroz blanco, she soaked the raw rice in very hot water for 15 to 20 minutes, then drained it and rinsed it under cold water until the water ran clear. That rinse stripped the surface starch, which is what makes cooked rice stick together. Once the rice was drained and slightly dried, she fried it in a thin layer of oil in a hot pan, stirring constantly until each grain turned from translucent white to a pale golden color. The frying sealed the outside of each grain so it held its shape through the simmering that came next. The result was rice where every single grain was separate, firm, and slightly nutty. Restaurants in Guadalajara and across the border in San Antonio served rice like this as a matter of pride. A plate of sopa de arroz where the grains clumped was a mark against the cook. The soak and fry method took an extra 20 minutes, but it turned a cheap side dish into something that could hold its own next to any main course. Today, most home cooks skip the soak entirely, and the difference shows. Number 18. Grinding chilies and spices by hand in a molcajete. Before electric blenders became affordable, every salsa, mole base, and spice blend was ground by hand in a molcajete, a heavy stone mortar carved from volcanic rock. The technique mattered as much as the ingredients. A housewife started with the hardest items first: rock salt and dried spices, crushing them to a powder. Then she added roasted garlic and chiles, working the pestle in a circular motion until a rough paste formed. The texture of a molcajete salsa was nothing like a blender version. It was chunky, uneven, and each bite tasted slightly different from the last. The stone also released tiny mineral fragments that added a subtle earthiness no machine could copy. A good molcajete was never washed with soap, only rinsed with water and rubbed with a little salt. Families passed them down for generations, and the older the stone, the smoother the grind. Number 17. Nixtamalizing corn at home with cal. Long before anyone sold bags of instant masa flour, housewives made their own masa from dried corn kernels. The trick was nixtamalization. Dried corn was simmered in water mixed with cal, which is calcium hydroxide, a white powder also called slaked lime. The alkaline water softened the tough outer hull of each kernel and unlocked nutrients that plain cooking could not release. After simmering, for about an hour, the corn sat in the liquid overnight. The next morning, the housewife rinsed each kernel by hand, rubbing off the loosened skin, then ground the soft kernels into fresh masa on a stone metate, or later at the neighborhood molino. The masa that came from this process was more fragrant and more nutritious than anything made from a bag. Families who lived far from a mill or a store had no choice but to do this themselves, and the women who did it fastest were the ones everyone watched. Number 16. Never throwing away a stale tortilla. In a 1960s Mexican household, a tortilla that went stale was not garbage. It was an ingredient. This single rule produced at least half a dozen entirely different meals depending on the day of the week and what else was in the kitchen. Stale tortillas torn into rough pieces became chilaquiles, simmered in salsa verde or roja until they softened into something between a casserole and a stew. Cut into strips and fried crisp, they became totopos for dipping or the base of a sopa de tortilla. Torn into small bits and scrambled with eggs, onion, and peppers, they became migas, a breakfast that fed a family in 10 minutes. Dried completely and left in a basket, they turned into tostadas the next time the oil got hot. Some women ground truly old, rock-hard tortillas into a coarse flour and stirred it into soups as a thickener, or mixed it back into fresh masa to stretch a batch. There was even a trick where a stale tortilla was dampened with a few drops of water, wrapped in a damp cloth, and reheated on the comal until it was soft again. It was not as good as fresh, but it was close enough to roll around beans and rice for a quick taco. The underlying principle was simple and absolute. Corn represented labor. Someone stood at the metate or waited at the mill. Someone formed each tortilla by hand and cooked it one by one on a hot comal. To throw that away was to waste the hours of the woman who made it. Every trick in this chain, from chilaquiles to migas to grinding them into flour, existed because wasting a tortilla was unthinkable. Number 15. Sun-drying strips of beef into machaca. In the deserts of Sonora, Chihuahua, and across the border in West Texas and Arizona, housewives preserved beef by cutting it into thin strips, salting it heavily, and hanging it on a wire or a wooden rack in direct sunlight. After 2 or 3 days in dry desert air, the meat turned hard and dark. That was machaca. To cook with it, a woman pounded the dried strips with a stone or the flat side of a knife until the fibers shredded apart. Then she rehydrated the shreds in a hot skillet with a little lard, scrambled in some eggs, and added diced tomato and green chile. Machaca con huevos was a breakfast staple that needed no refrigerator, no butcher visit, and almost no money. The dried meat could last for weeks, stored in a cloth sack in a cool corner of the kitchen. Number 14. Thickening any thin sauce with a spoonful of masa harina. When a salsa or a guisado came out too watery, a housewife did not reach for flour or cornstarch. She took a small handful of masa harina, mixed it with a splash of warm water until it formed a smooth slurry, and stirred it into the bubbling sauce. Within minutes, the sauce thickened to the exact consistency she wanted, and it carried a faint corn flavor that belonged there instead of the flat, gluey taste of wheat flour. This trick worked on red chile sauce, green tomatillo sauce, mole, and even bean soups. The masa dissolved invisibly. Nobody at the table knew it was there, but everyone noticed the sauce clung to the tortilla instead of running off the plate. Number 13. Rendering your own manteca from pork fat trimmings. Store-bought lard existed in the 1960s, but many Mexican housewives did not trust it. They made their own. Whenever a pig was butchered in the neighborhood or pork was bought from the carniceria, the fat trimmings and skin were saved. A housewife cut the fat into small cubes, dropped them into a heavy pot with a splash of water, and cooked them on the lowest possible flame for hours. The fat slowly melted out of the tissue, turning clear and golden. The leftover crispy bits of rendered skin were chicharrones, salted and eaten as a snack or crumbled into beans. The liquid fat was strained through a cloth into a clean jar or tin, where it solidified into pure, white manteca. Homemade manteca had a cleaner flavor than the commercial product, and a housewife who rendered her own could tell the difference in every tortilla and every pot of refried beans. Number 12. Keeping a rolling pot of beans going on the stove all week long. This might be the most essential trick on this entire list. In a 1960s Mexican household, a large pot of pinto beans was cooked on Sunday or Monday, usually with onion, garlic, a sprig of epazote, and a generous spoonful of lard. That pot never left the stove. Each day, the housewife scooped out what she needed for that meal, whether it was whole beans in broth for the afternoon comida, or a portion mashed and refried in lard for the evening. She added water as the level dropped, and she brought the pot back to a full boil at least once a day, which kept the beans from spoiling without any refrigeration. By Wednesday or Thursday, the broth had thickened into something almost creamy, dark and rich from days of slow reduction. The beans at the bottom of the pot were the softest, and the ones that had been added with fresh water on Tuesday still had a slight bite. That contrast in texture was part of the appeal. Toward the end of the week, when only a thick paste of beans remained at the bottom, she fried the whole thing flat in a skillet with lard until the edges went crispy. That was the final incarnation. A slab of deeply seasoned refried beans that tasted nothing like the first fresh bowlful served on Monday. The trick was the daily boil. Without it, the beans would sour by day 2 or 3 in a warm kitchen. With it, they lasted comfortably through Saturday. No single ingredient fed more people for less money across the Mexican-American Southwest than that one pot of beans kept alive on the back burner all week long. Number 11. Stretching ground beef by mixing in chayote or potato. When a pound of ground beef had to feed 6 or 7 people, a housewife peeled a chayote or a couple of potatoes, diced them small, and cooked them right into the meat for picadillo. The vegetable absorbed the fat and the seasoning from the beef, and once everything was diced fine enough and simmered with tomato and cumin, the chayote or potato was nearly impossible to tell apart from the meat itself. Children did not notice. Husbands did not ask. The plate looked full, and the meal stretched to cover every tortilla on the table. Chayote was the preferred choice in central Mexico and parts of the Southwest because it has almost no flavor of its own, which made it vanish into the dish completely. Number 10. Roasting garlic cloves in their papery skin on a bare comal. A 1960s housewife did not peel her garlic before roasting it. She dropped whole unpeeled cloves directly onto a dry comal over medium heat and let them sit, turning them every couple of minutes until the papery skin was spotted with black and the clove inside had gone completely soft. The skin worked as a natural wrapper. It kept the garlic from scorching while the flesh inside steamed in its own moisture. When the cloves were done, she pinched the bottom, and the roasted garlic slid right out like paste. That paste dissolved instantly into salsas, refried beans, soups, or any guisado she was building that day. The flavor was nothing like raw garlic. The sharpness was gone. What replaced it was something mellow, almost sweet, with a faint smokiness from the comal. The whole process took about 10 minutes and required no oil, no foil, no oven, and almost no attention beyond the occasional turn. In parts of Oaxaca and Puebla, cooks roasted tomatoes, chiles, and garlic on the comal at the same time, building an entire salsa base without ever lighting a second burner. Number 9. Making requesón from milk that had turned sour. In a house without reliable refrigeration, milk sometimes went bad before it could all be used. A housewife did not pour it out. She heated the soured milk gently in a pot until the curds separated from the whey, forming soft white clumps floating in a thin, yellowish liquid. She strained the curds through a clean cloth, pressed out the moisture, and what remained was requesón, a mild, crumbly fresh cheese that could be eaten the same day. Requesón was spread on tortillas with a drizzle of salsa, crumbled into enchiladas, or stirred into scrambled eggs. It was also folded into sweet fillings for empanadas and tamales dulces. The trick turned a loss into a gain. Milk that had gone bad was simply milk that had started the cheese-making process on its own. Number 8. Using bean broth as a cooking liquid for everything else. When a housewife scooped beans from her rolling pot, she did not drain the broth and throw it away. That liquid was treated like stock. She used it to cook the day's rice, giving it a savory, earthy undertone that plain water could never deliver. She thinned out a thick chili sauce with a ladleful of it. She stretched a pot of sopa by adding bean broth instead of water or canned broth that did not exist in most kitchens. If a child was sick, a cup of warm bean broth with a squeeze of lime and a pinch of salt was the first remedy, long before anyone thought about canned chicken soup. The broth carried protein, minerals from the clay pot, and the layered flavor of every ingredient that had been simmering in those beans for days. Throwing it out would have been like throwing away a meal. Number 7. Threading dried chiles onto heavy string and hanging them to cure in open air. When the late summer harvest brought more fresh chilies than any family could eat, a housewife did not reach for jars or a freezer. She threaded a thick needle with heavy cotton string and pierced each chile straight through the stem, one after another, until she had a long strand called a ristra. Those ristras went up on a nail on the porch, from the rafters, or along an outside wall where steady wind and dry heat could pull the moisture out slowly. Within a few weeks, the chilies were brittle, shrunken, and intensely concentrated in flavor. A single ristra could hang through an entire winter, and a cook simply snapped off what she needed for that evening's sauce. No salt, no smoke, no vinegar, no sealed container. Just moving air and patience. The technique worked because the whole chili dried evenly on the string without touching another surface, so mold never got a foothold. Families in New Mexico and across northern Chihuahua still hang ristras on their porches in the fall, and you can spot them drying along the roadsides near Hatch and Chimayo if you drive through at the right time of year. Number 6. Tenderizing a tough cut of meat overnight in a bath of lime juice and coarse salt. Good beef was expensive in the 1960s, and most families in the barrio bought whatever cut they could afford. That often meant a piece of meat that would chew like leather if you cooked it straight. So a housewife squeezed 3 or 4 limes into a shallow dish, mixed in a heavy pinch of coarse salt, laid the meat flat in the juice, and left it covered in the icebox overnight. The acid in the lime broke down the connective tissue in the meat, and the salt drew moisture to the surface and then back in, carrying the citrus flavor deep into the fibers. By the next morning, the meat was visibly softer and had taken on a faint tang that worked perfectly with cumin and chili powder. This was the foundation of carne asada in countless South Texas and northern Mexico households. The lime cure did what a butcher's mallet could not. It made a cheap, tough piece of beef taste like something worth sitting down for. Some cooks added a crushed clove of garlic or a splash of orange juice to the bath, but the basic formula was always the same: lime, salt, thyme. Number 5. Cooling a hot pot by setting it in a basin of cold water. Before refrigerators were common in rural Mexican and Mexican-American households, getting cooked food to cool down safely was a real problem. Leaving a hot pot out in a warm kitchen all night invited spoilage. So a housewife filled a large basin, a tina or a wash tub, with the coldest water available from the well or the tap, and nestled the hot pot right into it. The water drew the heat out of the pot much faster than air alone. In some homes, the basin was placed near an open window or a doorway, where the night air could keep the water cool. It was not refrigeration, but it brought the temperature down fast enough to get through the night safely. Number 4. Patching a cracked comal with a paste of ash and calcium oxide. A comal was one of the most important tools in the kitchen, and a good clay comal was expensive relative to a family's income. When a crack appeared, a housewife did not throw it away. She mixed wood ash from the stove with a small amount of the same calcium hydroxide used for nixtamal, and a few drops of water until she had a thick paste. She packed that paste into the crack, smoothed it flat, and let it dry completely before placing the comal back over the flame on low heat. The calcium oxide hardened in the heat and bonded with the clay, sealing the crack well enough that the comal could last months or even years longer. The patch would eventually darken to match the rest of the surface, and unless you looked closely, you would never know it was there. Number 3. Dry toasting spices on the comal before grinding them. A housewife never dumped raw cumin seeds or coriander straight into a dish. She scattered them on a dry comal over medium heat and shook them gently until the kitchen filled with a sharp, warm fragrance and the seeds turned a shade darker. That short blast of heat cracked open the essential oils inside the spice and made the flavor 2 or 3 times more intense than it would have been raw. After toasting, she ground them immediately in the molcajete while still warm, because warm spices crushed faster and released more oil. This trick applied to cumin, coriander, peppercorns, cloves, and even dried oregano, which was rubbed between the palms after a quick toast to release the oils before it went into a sauce or a pot of beans. Number 2. Lining the steamer pot with corn husks to make a natural rack. When a housewife cooked tamales, she did not have a fancy steamer insert. She took dried corn husks, the same ones used to wrap the tamales, and arranged them in a thick layer at the bottom of a large pot over a few inches of water. The husks created a platform that kept the tamales above the waterline while allowing steam to circulate freely. Sometimes she placed a coin at the bottom of the pot beneath the husks. When the water boiled, the coin rattled against the metal. If the rattling stopped, she knew the water had evaporated and she needed to add more before the pot burned dry. That coin trick saved more tamale batches than any timer or thermometer ever could. Number 1. Reading the heat of a wood fire with the palm of your hand. This was the trick that separated a good cook from a great one. In the 1960s, many Mexican and Mexican-American kitchens, especially in rural areas and along the border, still used wood-burning stoves or open fires. There were no dials, no temperature gauges, and no preheating. A housewife held her open palm a few inches above the comal or the grate and counted. If she could hold it there for 2 seconds, the heat was high, right for searing meat or charring peppers. 4 seconds meant medium, ideal for cooking tortillas. 6 or more meant low, the temperature for slow simmering beans or a mole that needed hours. She adjusted the heat by adding wood, spreading the coals apart, or sliding the pot to a cooler spot. Every decision was made by feel, not by numbers. And the women who cooked this way every day of their lives had a precision that no oven dial has ever matched. 25 tricks that never appeared in any cookbook because they lived in the hands of the women who used them. Every one of these techniques was invented out of necessity and perfected through repetition, in kitchens where nothing was wasted and everything had a purpose. If your abuela did any of these, or if you still do them yourself, leave a comment and tell us which ones your family kept alive. If this brought back a memory, hit the like button and share it with someone who grew up in that kitchen. And if you have not already, subscribe, because there is more of this story left to tell.